Hello, welcome to the Thinkers50 Radar 2022 series, brought to you in partnership with Deloitte. I'm Stuart Craner, and I'm the co-founder of Thinkers50, the world's most reliable resource for identifying, ranking, and sharing the leading management ideas of our age, ideas that can make a real difference in the world. In this weekly series of 45-minute webinars, we want to showcase some of those ideas to bring you the most exciting new voices of management thinking. And our guest today fits the bill perfectly. He's the Danish-born author and thought leader, Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg. Thomas is a globally recognized expert on innovation and problem solving. His books include Innovation as Usual, co-authored with Paddy Miller, and most recently, What's Your Problem? Thomas has shared and refined his reframing method with some of the leading organizations in the world, including Microsoft and the United Nations. The format today is that Thomas is going to explain what reframing is and share his latest thinking. Then we'll have a discussion fueled by your questions. So please post your questions as we go along. Thomas, welcome. The virtual stage is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stu, and hello, everybody. Great to have you online here. The central idea I want to focus on today is a missing link in the way we think about solving problems, and that's problems in the workplace, but also kind of global problems or problems at home for that matter. And the missing link has to do with the fact that we tend to think problem solving has two components. The ones you can see behind me here, like you analyze a problem and then you solve it. There is, though, a third and critical part of this, and that's the notion of how we frame problems, or if you want it in another way, the question, are we actually solving the right problem? And what I've found consistently, that framing is not a new idea, it's an old idea. And yet, despite us having known about this for more than half a century, people still don't understand the difference between framing and analysis. So to quickly introduce you to this, I'm going to share two things. I'm going to share a quick example of this, and then I'm going to show you a real-world case where you can see the power of framing problems correctly. This is a crucial skill. It is a big issue in my mind, how much we spend on basically solving the wrong problems, like falling in love with the wrong solutions sometimes, if you will. So, an example. I'd like you to imagine that you are the owner of a building. It's an office building, and your tenants in the building, they are complaining a lot about the elevator. Like, it's slow, and they're really like tired of that. So now they're threatening to break their leases because of this slow elevator. What you'll notice here is that the problem isn't presented to you neutrally. Somebody has already framed the problem for you and said, well, the problem is that the lift is slow. And here you see two different mistakes. Inexperienced problem solvers, what they do is they jump straight into solution mode. They say, okay, the problem is that the elevator is slow. How do we make it faster? Let's brainstorm on that. And they show up with an analysis of, hey, we could put in a bigger engine that pulls it up faster. We could tweak the algorithm. We could buy a new elevator, and here's the 15 providers of new elevators that, this one is the cheapest. They don't notice that they have been trapped in a solution space. The interesting mistake, though, is the second one, and that comes back to the difference between framing and analysis. And this is a mistake that even really experienced, clever problem solvers often commit. That mistake is to ask, why is the elevator slow? Going in and saying, okay, now we can do a root cause analysis on this and ask why 5 times and so on. And what they never notice is that they effectively get trapped in the first framing of the problem. So what's an alternative? Well, if you ask a really experienced landlord, and people are complaining about a slow elevator. Well, why don't we put up a mirror in the hallway? Because what happens when you put a mirror up anywhere is, of course, that people go, I'm busy, oh, that's beautiful. And they forget time. Centrally here, you'll notice how the mirror example here, it really showcases something important. that sometimes you don't want to necessarily tackle the first framing of the problem. There may actually be a better problem to solve. In this case, like thinking about, wait, is the problem really the speed of the elevator? Or is the problem that people are waiting? And then if that turns out to be the problem, well, then we can go in and fix it with a mirror, or maybe there are other ways of dealing with it. This is the central idea of reframing, of going in, not jumping into solution mode, not necessarily even getting trapped in analysis, but through the first kind of delving deep into the first problem, but taking that first like mental habit of saying, taking a step back and saying, wait, is this necessarily the right problem to focus on? Is there another way of thinking about what might be going on in this situation? This is a very simple example of it. And this is, I'll suggest that you actually try to remember this, because it is an amazing way of just explaining it to other people. If you're in a meeting and you need to get somebody to start thinking differently about the problem, the slow elevator story can often make them understand why you're asking questions about their problem. But what I'm going to show you now is one of the most thought-provoking cases that I ran into during my research on the book and so on, where you see how thinking differently about a problem can sometimes change an entire industry. And this is an industry that I don't know if many of you are familiar with it. It is a little bit of a sideshow industry, if you will, unless of course you are working on it. It has to do with dogs. And this is a case from the US where there has been for decades an issue with shelter dogs. What is that issue? Well, about 3 million dogs every single year enter a shelter. And historically, about half of those have been adopted through the work of volunteer groups and shelters and so on, which means that something like more than 1 million extra homes are needed for dogs every single year. And COVID may have helped this a little bit. As many of you know, there's a surge in interest in dogs when we had to stay at home. But it's a good question how that's going to go now. COVID may be hopefully on the wane. This problem may be about to get worse than ever. What I want to show you with this is how people think about the nature of the problem and what types of solutions they then jump into. A lot of people think about it as an issue around motivation or awareness. And if that's your kind of take on it, well, your solution will typically be some kind of advertising. You go in, you create a campaign. This is an example, like, here's a dog. It's clearly not in a good place. You can help. Really just trying to change people's motivation or their awareness about this problem. That's not a bad approach. This actually, this works, and this helps every year getting some dogs adopted. But it's not enough, and it hasn't been enough for decades. So now I'm going to introduce you to a woman who has basically upturned this industry within the last 5 years. And that woman you see here, her name is Weiss. She is based in Los Angeles. She is the founder of a rescue group that's called Downtown Dog Rescue. And Laurie started looking at an interesting statistic in this space. The statistic was, well, when you're looking at the animals that come into a shelter, 30% of those are what's called owner surrenders. An owner surrender, that's not a stray. It hasn't run away or anything. An owner surrender is when the owners of the dog comes to the shelter and deliberately hands over their dog, say, here, take it. Now, you can probably imagine, like, if you work in this space, if you're a volunteer that you love animals, you've dedicated a good deal of your time to help them, you probably don't have a good impression of those people, right? They're bad people. This is your thinking about this. Like, we have a big problem with a lot of people. They should never have had a dog. Bad owners, big issue, core to this whole thing. And here's something fascinating. Once you get trapped in a specific way of thinking about the problem, then you start creating solutions that may go against your goal. what the industry, why it's because there's a widespread belief in the idea that a ton of people are bad, should never have had a dog. Well, then they create screening. I'm going to show you a form now from an animal adoption center. And this is basically the form you have to fill out if you want to save a dog potentially from dying. All right, here we go. We would like to have a ton of things here. You can see like references, veterinary references, name of your employer. They may actually come to your home and check whether you have the proper setup to take care of a dog. Here is what Laurie did differently, because she, to some extent, she recognized that this is it's well intended, but it also means we are creating barriers to adoption, which is our goal. And so what Laurie did to test her thinking around, what's really going on with this problem? She set up a learning experiment. That learning experiment was in Los Angeles. She found one shelter. She took one of her people to ask them to stand in front of the entrance to the shelter. And then when a family came and wanted to hand over their dog or another pet, would you like to keep it if you could? First data point. 3 out of 4 families said yes to that. Most people who handed over an animal to a shelter did not, in fact, want to. They were often in tears when they were doing so. And then when the staff member asked, so wait a minute, like, what's the problem? Why are you handing it over if you don't want to? And it turned out a huge under-recognized issue in this didn't have to do with bad owners. It had to do with economics, with poverty. A lot of these people had had their dogs for years. They had taken good care of it. They loved it as much as we love our dogs. But they were also in a financial strait so dire that when a new landlord, for instance, comes, like they have to move to a new building, and the landlord comes and says, you know what, you have to put down $150 deposit to have the dog here. That's not money they can get access to. We're talking people who sometimes struggle to feed their own kids. It's a food insecurity, as it's called. It is just not an option for them to put $150 on the table to house a dog. Once Laurie realized that this was a huge issue and was the cause of many of the adoption issues they saw, well, then she said, well, instead of spending our money on helping dogs that are already in shelters, can we just help them stay with their first family? Can we go in, put down a deposit of $150? Most of those we'll get back. And thus help and rethink what's going on here in a different way. And when Laurie looked at the numbers after running up and setting up a proper program with this, she found that she could go create pretty amazing savings. They used to spend around $85 per animal they helped. This reduced it to around $60 per animal they helped. So a pretty dramatic increase in the number of pets they could help for the same amount of money. And for those of you who are interested in this, if you are in the shelter world or similar, well, you can read more about this case in Laurie's book. It's on Amazon, called First Home, Forever Home. I show this because for me, it's such a potent reminder of the notion that we sometimes get trapped in the way we think about problems. And once we're trapped in them, we fall in love with the ideas, or like we somehow get locked into it. Once in a while, if we can develop the ability or get better at this practice of going in and saying, wait, are we even solving the right problem? Is there something here about the stakeholders or the customers or whoever we're dealing with that we don't understand? Then we can sometimes create dramatic change and maybe not even needing new technology. Like Laurie's solution didn't have to do with an app. It didn't have to do with Bitcoin, blockchain, whatever. It was just about having greater empathy with the people she was trying to help. That's the introduction. That is the kind of quick crash, 10-minute lightning introduction to what reframing is about and how the effect can play out in the real world. So the intent now, as Stu mentioned, is to delve into questions. So please fire away what you might have into the chat. It could be a question, it could be an observation, it can be anything. And Stu as well. Stu will kind of mastermind the rest of the session here, so we can go deep. So Stu, over to you.
I think mastermind might be overstating it, Thomas. We might have to reframe that. But presumably, from what you're saying, the cost of getting it wrong must be enormous. In all, I mean, the dog example was $85 to $60, but that must be multiplied many times in different situations.
Yeah, I mean, there are several scenarios here, right? The dog example is interesting because we were solving the problem, but we just hadn't discovered a better way to do it, so to speak. So you can consider that like a lost opportunity. What's worse, I think, is when we fall for the wrong problem. And how big of a cost is that? Well, if you discover, imagine you go to the doctor and the doctor gets the diagnosis wrong. Well, if you go next week again and they get the diagnosis right, you're probably good. So if you can discover it quickly, that's great. But if you don't discover it quickly, if you start somehow to get locked into the original diagnosis, well, then you wake up, without a leg, and it's kind of, oh, sorry, it wasn't your leg, it was your liver, So that's a metaphor of a bit, but that happens in organizations. We go in, we start to fall in love with the solution, we create milestones, we tie our bonuses to it, we build organizational structures to support it, and then sometimes we realize, this is actually not what we should be focusing on, but then it's often too late, we're committed, and it can be a really, really expensive exercise to try to turn the ship around, if you will.
A couple of questions come in, a couple of points. They're quite complicated, actually, because it's it's kind of a complex issue, isn't it?
It is.
And it shouldn't be, I suspect. But Michael de Camp says, what question can we ask to see if a solution has been baked into the problem frame or problem statement?
Oh, so a brilliant example. And Michael, great to see you here. There's an issue here Michael is pointing out, right? That sometimes when you ask people, hey, what's the problem? They have actually put a solution into the problem statement. They have, well, the problem is that, you're an idiot and you should be not an idiot. That's exaggerated. But let's take a specific example, a startup. And the startup is not selling the new product really. It's not going that well. And then somebody says, you know what? We really need to find a way of finding more money for the marketing. We need to market better. Maybe we need a new campaign. What they don't realize there is, maybe this isn't the marketing issue. Maybe it's actually because there's something about the product or service that they haven't gotten right yet. And posting more money into marketing is just going to exacerbate the startup's problems because they're spending resources that don't really matter. So getting in, starting to develop this habit of looking at problems and starting to kind of smell, wait a second, has somebody actually baked a solution into the problem? Really, really important thing to try to observe.
Sean Duval has an interesting point. The solution to a problem depends on what the solution is, not on what the problem is. And that's a solutions-focused approach.
Exactly. I think there's this beautiful thing that happens sometimes. Well, not so beautiful when it has real world consequences, but really it is that you have, again, fallen in love with a solution, and then you kind of retroactively construct your understanding of the problem based on that. This you'll see in a lot of places where people, for some reason, are committed to this either commercially or ideologically, or maybe they just fell in love with something, So critical thing, and even just being aware of it, when you start, it's almost as like a spider sense you develop. You start when you run into problems, you start to develop this sense of what's going on. If people are doing this, or if people are baking in a solution, as Michael mentioned before. So really important observation.
So basically, it's kind of a question of kind of returning to first principles with a clear mind. It reminds me of kind of Clay Christensen's idea of jobs to be done.
Jobs to be done. Yeah,
cutting away all the clutter and just really focusing on what the problem is, because as you say, there might be a better problem to solve.
Yeah.
But But that's really difficult, isn't it, in an organization when there's all the clutter of, you got the clutter of other people, you got the clutter of how things have always been done or how you've always solved things.
Yeah. Two observations here. Like, jobs to be done is a great example of how you can use some of this thinking specifically with regards to customers. Like, that's the domain we see jobs to be done getting used in when you are a startup or a company trying to help or develop something new for customers. One of the insights I've had here is that we don't take that mindset beyond customers. Like, when we're dealing with problems that are inside an organization or globally, or looking at your own family, whatever's going on there, like, we forget about that. We don't necessarily think about, like, even jobs to be done. Like, what is my sister really trying to do here when you're having a family conflict with your sister? Like, that basic thinking, actually trying to expand that into other domains of thinking, is really, really important. So now you mentioned, Stu, you mentioned the complexity of it too, right? I weirdly enough found that the solution to complexity is not more to have a really thorough framework. And this may sound a little counterintuitive, but when you look at the history of people trying to create frameworks for this, very often they have created these very big, elaborate methods. They're like the broadsheets, A3, tons of different elaborate frameworks. But the second a framework becomes elaborate, you don't really use it a lot. So one of the counterintuitive things I discovered was you're actually often better off teaching people how to do this in a few minutes using a very few rules of thumb for doing this, because then they get to use it much more compared to thinking of it as a big demanding exercise that you can only do twice a year, if you will.
And who should be involved in this? Is it something where you should involve as many people as possible? So to some extent, I'm thinking, no, you want to narrow it down, because the more people, the more complicated, the more possible responses there are. So what are there optimum amounts of people to be involved?
I think of this from a very pragmatic angle, in the sense that more diversity is good, but what do you have time to involve? Like, if for some problems, you literally just have maybe 15 minutes to think about this, and then your option is to turn to the person sitting next to you and kind of just run it by him. For more important problems, you do want to invest the energy in pulling in diverse perspectives. And why is that so critical? We talk a lot about diversity, but one of the central things you see in problem solving is, when you have a problem, theoretically, you're the person who knows the most about it. But in reality, we are often too close to our own problems to see them clearly. So one of the most powerful shortcuts to spotting your own blind angles, if you will, is to pull in people who are further away from this. People who think differently, people who have different backgrounds, and so on. That's one of the most clearly seen in the research. Kind of the power of diversity is just helping get different perspectives early in the process before you get locked into a specific viewpoint. So general rule, the more important the problem is to solve, the more effort you need to put into pulling different people into the room or the virtual discussion with you.
And it's great to see on our virtual discussion, we have somebody joined us from Nepal for the first time. I've noticed somebody from Nepal, okay. And Albert has just joined from Namibia. And very nice to have you on board. Interesting point from Ruth Gautian, who I know you know, and we can recommend her wonderful book, The Success Factor. And Ruth says, I wonder how reframing the problem could help build critical thinking, curiosity, the search for gaps in thinking, and understanding, reduce burnout and higher engagement.
Yeah, so Ruth is, I don't know if you followed Thinkers50, you know that Ruth and I were both nominated for a prize, and Ruth actually won it, so she is certified smarter than me. Classically of Ruth, she has put out a very clever observation here, namely what this can do. Because you'll notice what's happening here. Like, when you think, and there's some links here, for instance, to psychological safety, Amy Edmondson's concept, but what you'll notice when you have a problem, you have a discussion, it's a difficult discussion, like we often end up sitting here and there's somebody here who's trying to help us and they are firing away solutions at us. Hey, maybe you could, or that. And then what happens is people put up a screen. Like you just throw up the fence barriers, because there's something in us that resists when people just offer solutions most of the time. This is a fundamentally different thing. This places you almost on the same side as the person. You can even do that physically. And you start to explore the problem together. And that once you get to that, then you can often see a lot of positive effects on the way you work together with people, where it becomes a more collaborative thing. I don't know if it's a full panacea to all the issues here that Ruth put up, but it can really help. And this, as you'll notice, is a method you can use on almost any question you're facing, whether it's a strategic issue or whether it's like, hey, our team is not really working, or I have a relationship in my life that's kind of difficult to deal with, or whatnot.
A number of people have brought up the issue of asking questions, and it might relate to Hal Gregerson's work at MIT about catalytic questions. So
Yep.
Afzul says, you need to pull in people who will ask the questions that the problem owner won't. Michael de Camp follows up by saying question storming sessions.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so question storming sessions, are they a thing?
Well, this builds on, you mentioned Hal Gregerson, and I love his work on, he calls it question bursts. It's built originally on some work that was back in the 1987 thereabouts by John Rowland. He called it quest storming, lots of different terms. Question storming to me is the practice of pulling in people, as Atul mentioned, and have them ask questions of you without trying to answer them immediately. Because if you go into a traditional Q&A, well, you get 4 questions, and then you have spent 4 answers. And if it's a lecturing type, they're just going to use the question as a bridge to lecture even more. Question storming, question bursts, if you like that term, is really about trying to coral in as many questions as quickly as you can. And this can be a couple of minutes you use on it to really try to get the width and breadth of different perspectives on this thing. It can be really powerful in person. It can be even better on a virtual setting, because there everybody can just use the chat to type in, versus in a room you still kind of have to listen one at a time, if you will. So really powerful practice. I suggest you try it. And there's a little bit of a guide on my website, how to reframe. I'll show that later if it's something you're new to. You can also check out Hal Gregerson's amazing article. It's called Better Brainstorming, I think from 2018 thereabouts.
Ruth has a follow-up comment. I just hang out with people who are smarter than me and listen to their brilliance. I think the key word there, Ruth, is listen, because listening is a really underestimated and underused skill, but necessary if you're going to reframe. And
something I've noticed, building on that, I run workshops on reframing with companies all the time, and it is really noticeable to me if you give somebody to talk, like a chance to talk with 2 people about their problem for 5 minutes. Notice the talking to listening ratio. There are people who will spend 4 of those 5 minutes providing ever more detail, and there are people, more in Ruth's spirit, that will go in and say, hey, here's like 30 seconds of context, and now I'll just listen. Those are the people that maximize the value of those 5 minutes and get more different perspectives than the talker. So I'll invite you personally, maybe to try to observe your own talking to listening ratio when you are in a discussion with people.
Mathieu comes back with an interesting point. He says, questioning the question of my boss can irritate him a bit, even if I'm convinced 200%. Well,
yeah. Well, Mathieu, I have bad news for you there. Your boss hates you. It's kind of it. But I have a great example here. Like I want to. Well, okay. First observation. You're pointing out the issue of resistance. What do you do when people resist like your questions about the problem? There's several different strategies. I mentioned one, which is to share the slow elevator example. You can also kind of, make them aware of my book. That helps to legitimize a discussion around this. Or if you think the tension is between the 2 of you, sometimes you can actually just get a third person into the room who makes the same point. Maybe you won't get the credit for that, but you'll get it done. So there are some ways of kind of dealing with resistance. And now, since you mentioned a bad boss, I can't help but share this story. beautiful example from Robert Sternberg, who's one of the key creativity researchers. The story is of a boss. And he's a quite horrible boss. And the real protagonist here is one of his people, a manager who's kind of like, he loves the company he's in, but the boss is just so horrible that he's decided to get out of there. So he goes to a headhunter and he says, I'd like to find a new job as similar to my old job as possible. And the headhunter says, not a problem. There's a ton of demand in the industry for experienced executives at the moment. I can find your job very quickly. Now, the story might have ended there, and according to Sternberg, this is a real story. But the man went back and spoke to his wife about this. And the wife was somebody who was actually trained in reframing and thinking creatively about problems. And they found a smarter solution. So the next day, the manager goes back to the headhunter and he says, here's the CV of my boss. Can you potentially find a new job for him? And according to Sternberg, what happened was that the headhunter found a new job for the boss. The boss, not having any idea what was going on, accepted the new job, and the manager got promoted into his old boss's job. So a beautiful example of rethinking, like how your approach to problems, what your real goal is, and make sure that might help you in this situation if your boss turns out to be recalcitrant and resistant to your advice over time.
Yeah. So it's about finding a better problem to solve, and the problem is finding another job for your boss. There's a number of comments about simplicity and complexity, because you're kind of caught between. I know you've kind of answered this, but Robert might have joined us later, and he says complex problems demand complex solutions. Your thoughts, and then there's another comment about from Philip John about break down complex problems into smaller bite-sized pieces, keep things simple. I think there's always that simplicity and complexity battle at work in this sort of thing.
Yes, I think when I started thinking of this, I thought exactly that thing, like complex problems need complex solutions. And then weirdly enough, I just kept running into stories akin to Laurie's story, where when you're looking at Laurie and her impact on the industry, that wasn't a complex solution. It was maybe difficult to truly discover it, but enacting it once you had realized it worked, that actually requires very little except for a mindset shift within the people. So sometimes I think we can get lucky and find relatively, the magic bullets. They are sometimes out there. Having said that, of course, there are problems, climate change, that where the magic bullets seem to be a little bit few and far between. And in those cases, some people use the term wicked problems. In those cases, it really becomes like, in this case, a humanity-wide issue where you try to develop a portfolio of approaches. And there, I think you're right, complexity does matter. Now, it's a rich topic, so we can stay there on the complexity or not, but that was just a quick initial reflection.
A point from Anastasia in Greece. We don't get many people listening from Greece, so it's nice of you to join us, Anastasia. And do you find that meditation practices, which in essence impact our neurological state, can be practical tools?
Interesting.
I suppose that, what you're saying, Thomas, is people faced with a problem kind of rush in and solve the same problem. They identify as the same problem they solved before. So can kind of more meditative practices make them think differently?
So first, I haven't actually looked at research within this. So take my answer here as a guess more than anything. To the extent meditation helps you develop a more contemplative approach, I think that's exactly right. Like you go in and you maybe have a habit of like not being immediately impacted by whatever happens, but staying like, you stay in a Zen-like state and you're like, wait a second, let's just spend a couple of minutes thinking here. So to the extent that's true, I think that's spot on. The one danger I see potentially is if meditation turns into rumination. If you have a habit of like, you have a problem and you know what, you've just sat and thought about that for ages and you keep circular, like moving around in your head. One of the key things I found, and this is a very simple advice if you have a problem right now, is describe the problem to somebody else. Like get hold of a good friend. deliberately ask them not to try to solve it with you, but just to explore it with you, and just state the problem to them. If you like, you can try to write it down beforehand if you need to get your own thoughts in order. It is so weird to me to have observed that people can walk around with a problem for 5 years and still actually be fuzzy around it. It's kind of nebulous, unclear, until you put it into words or into writing. That's when you start maybe opening the door to solutions. So simple practice here, starting to share your problem with somebody else.
Rick Spann, who's always making helpful comments, draws attention to the idea of generous listening, which is a really nice idea, I think, and would actually help the world generally. I think a good question, Thomas, I think, is who is good at this? You must come across organizations and individuals who are really good at figuring out how to reframe naturally.
Well, I think I'm not sure I can point to a commonality, and I think, Rick, your guess around jazz musicians, and I actually even anybody whose core job depends on listening carefully. Like I would imagine advice columnists, therapists, like coaches for that matter, like they are more attuned to this. There is one, there's one challenge I want to throw in there, which is generous listening is easier when you have time, and we don't generally have time. So an interesting observation I made is if you try to be too much in the almost contemplative mindset, if you work in a regular workplace, somebody's going to hurry you along pretty soon. So it can actually help if you develop a practice of kind of like, we're going to do generous listening or reframing or whatever, but it's going to be a limit. We're going to time box it. It's only going to be 5 minutes. Because that, as long as we know, imagine that I'm really a type A, I want to make things happen and so on, and I see one of my teammates just going into thinking mode. Now, I'm going to be a lot more comfortable with that if I know it's only for 5 minutes. My big fear is that they get trapped in analysis and they just sit and think forever instead of moving forward. So figuring out how to do generous listening, practicing that, practicing reframing, but also practicing and establishing a habit of doing it in short increments of time. That can really help when you're dealing with tense situations or people who have a lot of drive or you're just busy.
Philip John says, another way to reframe is how will the solution to the problem benefit all the stakeholders? So I suppose that's kind of reframing the solution, isn't it? Broadening the potential solution.
Exactly. And I think one really good, in the business space, one really good resource here is Ron Adner, his book, The Wide Lens. One of his central ideas is that innovations, or like really anything, doesn't happen in isolation between two people. It happens in an ecosystem. And unless you actually understand the impact on all of the major players, you may run into trouble. Super great example from that book is Michelin introduced a new set of tires that wouldn't go flat. And they had figured out the entire ecosystem in terms of introducing it. Everybody thought it was going to be the big hit, except when you looked at the service stations, like the people who actually changed the tires. They had very little incentive to do it. They had to install very complicated, expensive machines in order to get it done. And because Michelin had not understood that, they thought just like normally they're just, secondary players. But in this new ecosystem created by the innovation, they were actually critical. And that there's a story there in the Wide Lens where basically this sunk the whole thing, that you didn't understand the Wide Lens or the full ecosystem of stakeholders, if you will. Really great point. You're never just looking at one person, even if it seems that way. There are always hidden actors in your space somewhere.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And Ron Adner's work is actually much recommended. I think he's got a new book out as well. Thomas, so what should people do? What are the key takeaways you like to give to people to put to work in their own organizations, their own situations?
Critically, I'd say two things. First, just understanding what we've spoken about here, the difference between framing and analysis, and sharing that with the people you work with. Because this is going to be difficult if you're the only genius in the room. It's a lot easier if people have just been introduced to this and they understand why you're spending time in seemingly just exploring the problem, if you will. And then the second piece of advice is try to practice as much as possible. This is partially it's something you need to know, and partially it is a craft. So instead of saving this for your big strategic problem coming up in half a year, like go back this week, like find anything that you've been dealing with for a while and try to actually sit down and spend a little bit of time reframing it. Whether it's that your son doesn't want to play the tuba, or your impossible boss as Matthew, or you want to write a book but you can't get started, what's going on, or like any problem. Just try to sit down and practice reframing a little bit more. The more you do it, the more you become great at doing it on the fly when it really matters.
And do you find you apply the ideas in your own life?
I do a good deal. There are stories from my dating life I'm not going to share here, but exactly. But I would say even when I wrote the book, it was I think initially, for instance, I thought, I have to gather all the knowledge that we have around reframing, and that would have become this very heavy tome of useless knowledge. What clicked for me was when I thought, no, my job is to make this as accessible as possible in as simple a way as possible. Like that's the problem we haven't solved with reframing, making it super simple and accessible so you can use it on an average Wednesday afternoon in a meeting for 5 minutes. That was one of my big shifts in terms of reframing something I was doing.
Rick Span's come back with a development of his ideas about jazz and generous listening, and I think there is quite a lot in that, in the comparisons with jazz and your ability to come up with solutions and see problems and solutions in a different way, in a spontaneous way as well, which is interesting, I think.
I completely agree. I only say, like, why is it always jazz getting all the credit? Like, what about heavy metal? Like Norwegian heavy metal? Like, aren't they listening?
I think that's a matter of taste, Thomas. Good and bad.
Exactly.
But I think the issue you raised about the timescales and time pressures are really interesting, because in some ways what you're saying is you need to prioritize. You need to be able to identify the problems that demand the time and the space to be able to reframe, and not all problems are created equal.
Exactly. There are many problems we could attack, but probably only a few of those will have a real lasting impact. So the ability to go in and just question your initial understanding of the problem, it can really, really help in terms of discovering those other avenues before you get locked into a specific approach.
I mean, you work with organizations throughout the world, and do people respond in different ways? Do CEOs identify this as an issue? Do they really kind of sympathize with it? And do middle managers really like it? Who responds best to it?
I think the consistent thing I've seen is that everybody enthusiastically agrees that this is a big problem for their colleagues. Like, oh yeah, my people do this all the time. And their self-insight might not quite be at the same level. So beyond that, I'd say this is typically most impactful when you're not at the very front lines. If you're in a factory and you're putting together something on an assembly conveyor belt, your problems tend to be of a different nature. Like, that's not always reframing that's the right thing there. But the second you move into anything that has to do with other people, with complex, fussy problems, well, then this is helpful. I've yet to meet a group that have not found this to be useful, no matter where in the hierarchy or in what industry they worked in.
And so where does your research go next?
Still to be determined. I am in that phase. I think of myself as a truffle pig. When I go out and kind of sniff around in the forest and my nose sometimes catches something interesting, like it did with reframing, I'm in that phase where I'm rummaging around in the forest and trying to figure out what's coming up next.
Looking for metaphorical truffles.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We're out of time, Thomas, but can we finish with one more slide from you?
Yeah, what I'm going to share here is if you want to delve deeper into this, if this is something you think could be helpful to get better at, Well, a couple of resources. Some you have to pay for, like the book, but others are free. The book itself is basically a step-by-step guide. There's a ton of real-world examples of this, and there's also actually some stuff around Matthew's question with how do you handle a boss that doesn't want to listen, or resistance, and so on. So you can delve deeper into that. It is coming out in 13 languages. You can see some of them here below. And if you want to sniff to this before actually spending $20 on a book, there is a website, howtoreframe.com. It has a checklist with some strategies you can try to apply when you're reframing. It has a bunch of the history of this. Like, so if you're interested in the research, you can delve deep into that, and a few other things. It's all free. You don't have to sign up or anything. Just check that out. And finally, you can always follow me if you want to find out what the truffle pig ends up finding in the forest, or if you just want to reach out. I am Thomas Wedell on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever you will. And that's pretty much it.
Thomas, thank you very much for joining us. I can't get the idea of the truffle pig out my head at the moment.
Apologies.
I can recommend the book. What's Your Problem? Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you everyone for joining us from throughout the world. Next week we're talking with Vanessa Bones about her new book about influence. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.
Thanks.